Hey everyone, Pastor George here with today's Bible study recap. And today in Bible study, we looked at Judges 2 and what that had to tell us about what was going on. So, if you'll remember last week, in the last video, I did an introduction to Judges, a little bit what it was about, but also what it is going to try and tell us about the cycle that Israel gets in. And you could see that last week. But this week, it becomes a lot more clear because we see the fallout. Last week, they go further into the promised land. They're conquering. Some of them do what God has commanded. Others do not. They end up taking slaves and forming alliances. And we see the fallout and what God has to say. So the passage that we read for this week, chapter 2, begins with God taking on not taking on flesh. That's not true. That's what he does in the incarnation. But we call this a theophany, so an appearance of God. So the angel of the Lord appears to the Israelites at this place called Bochum. And when they're there, he tells them how they have failed, right? He reminds them of who he is, that he led them out of Egypt. He was with them during the Exodus. He brought them to the promised land, but they have failed to do what he has asked them. They have broken the covenant. He actually makes it clear that he is not, right? He says, I will never break my covenant. And that tells us a lot about God, that even though the people are unfaithful and he has every right to leave them, he doesn't. And I think that's a really powerful symbol of how God acts in the world and how he lives out his call, right? You see this in the New Testament with this talk about the elect and Jesus talking about how the sheep know his voice and he won't abandon his sheep, things like that. This is a consistent theme with God. It's part of his nature, who he is, that he is just and merciful. And you see that actually play out in this passage. So he's upset, right? And he says, well, because you've done this, I'm not going to drive out the nations, and you're going to have to live with this thorn in your side because of these actions that you've taken. You haven't listened, and so you're going to deal with it. Then we get a repeat of the death of Joshua. And this, what is in this passage is almost a word-for-word repeat of what the book of Joshua says when Joshua dies. And it's all just to say, to again bring this thing out for the reader, that this is the introduction to the book of Judges, right? So, and it also sets up the repeating pattern that we're going to see. And the repeating pattern is this. There is a judge, right, who God is going to establish because he is using these other tribes or these other people to bring justice down upon Israel. You know, he actually talks about how the hand of the Lord is against them, right? Until this time in the Old Testament, the hand of the Lord is only used against Israel's enemies. But here in this passage for today, we see God bring it to the Israelites. So eventually, though, he relents. He appoints a judge to save the people. And the judge is a military leader who beats the enemy. And during that time, people are really faithful. But once the judge dies, people fall away again. And you have that continual cycle in the life of the people here. And so that's going to be the cycle of the book of Judges. You're going to see it. We're going to have good judge who comes about and leads the people, and then the people are going to fall away and they're going to stray, and then they're going to go back to serving these pagan gods, and then things are going to get bad because God is going to bring punishment upon them for breaking the covenant, but then have mercy and appoint a judge to save them, and that's going to go on and repeat itself. And in that, I think we can see a little bit of our own lives, right? We talked about how maybe some of our reactions to this is to say, how can they just keep doing this? But I think if we're very honest with ourselves, we see how we have not always been faithful, how we have not always done what God has asked us, even when we've seen him work very powerfully in our lives, right? We prayed for healing in the church, and healing's been brought to people. And what is our response to that? Well, whatever. Go on and live in our lives, right? And I'm not saying it's all it's just that, you know, well, maybe I am saying this, but it's not just that, you know, we're unique in that. I think that's just the human condition, is to see God's goodness and either attribute it to our own methods and ways of doing things, or just to completely understand who he is and try and remind ourselves of that. But But we cannot be surprised when generations rise up and do not know him or do not want to acknowledge him, even if they know him, because that's kind of the natural human heart. And so we see the consequences of that in the book of Judges. And we're going to get to our first two judges next week when we read Judges 3, which I'm excited about. So I'll see all of you then. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday, and peace out.